Ever wondered if a simple walk in the park could destroy a young woman's future? Or if society once believed that fainting was a sign of true femininity? Could reading too many books actually make a single woman undesirable or even ill? And what if expressing an opinion or laughing with a little too much enthusiasm could lead to whispers and ruined reputations? The Victorian era, a time known for its grand achievements and strict social codes, held some truly baffling expectations for unmarried women. Get ready to explore a world where everyday actions were governed by rules so peculiar they might make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. These are some of the most astonishing rules that single women were expected to live by, rules that paint a vivid picture of a very different time. Number 8. The Chaperone Mandate. Never unescorted, never alone. Imagine this. You want to pop out to the shops, take a leisurely stroll through the local park, or perhaps attend a delightful concert. Simple enough, right? Not if you were a single woman of respectable standing in the Victorian era. One of the most unshakable rules governing your life would have been the absolute necessity of a chaperone. This was not a casual suggestion. It was a social decree. To be seen in public unescorted, or even in the company of a gentleman without a proper guardian, was to invite immediate suspicion and quite possibly social ruin. Why such a strict rule? Victorian society placed an enormous emphasis on a woman's reputation, often referred to as her virtue or purity. This reputation was considered incredibly fragile, like a delicate piece of china that could be shattered by the slightest misstep or even the perception of impropriety. A single woman, particularly a young one, was seen as vulnerable, not just to the potential advances of unscrupulous men, but also to her own supposedly weaker, more emotional nature. The chaperone, therefore, served as a guardian, a protector of this precious reputation. She was a visible symbol that the young woman was respectable and under watchful care. Who qualified as a suitable chaperone? Typically, this role fell to an older, married woman. A mother was ideal, but an aunt, a married older sister, or even a trusted family friend could serve. For wealthier families, a paid companion or a governess might fulfill this duty. Key was that the chaperone needed to be a figure of maturity and unimpeachable respectability herself. In some slightly more relaxed circumstances, even a significantly younger brother might be deemed acceptable, though this was less common and seen as less secure. The chaperone's presence was required in an astonishing array of situations. If a young lady wished to go shopping, she needed her chaperone. If she was taking a walk even in broad daylight, her chaperone was expected to be by her side. Attending parties, balls, theatrical performances, art exhibitions, or even church services often required this constant companionship, especially if gentlemen outside her immediate family were likely to be present. Even receiving a male visitor at home was not a private affair. The suitor would be entertained in the formal drawing room, and the chaperone would be present throughout the visit, a silent or sometimes not so silent observer, ensuring that conversation and conduct remained within the strict bounds of propriety. Carriage rides with a gentleman who was not a close relative. Unthinkable without a chaperone. The fear was that any unsupervised interaction between a single woman and a man could lead to gossip at best and a serious scandal at worst. A whispered rumor that a young lady had been seen alone with a gentleman could be enough to damage her marriage prospects significantly. She might be labeled as fast, forward, or indiscreet, terms that were social death sentences in an era where a good marriage was considered the primary goal for women of the middle and upper classes. Of course, the stringency of this rule often depended on social class. Working-class women who had to earn a living frequently traveled to and from work unescorted out of sheer necessity. They did not have the luxury of a dedicated chaperone and societal expectations for them, while still emphasizing respectability, were different. However, for any woman aspiring to or maintaining a position in good society, the chaperone was an almost inescapable part of life. Even older, unmarried women, sometimes referred to as spinsters, were often expected to have some form of escort or companion, though the rules might have been slightly less rigid for them compared to a young debutante. What happened if a woman dared to flout this convention? The consequences could be severe. She would certainly become the subject of malicious gossip. Her family might face social ostracism. Her chances of making an advantageous marriage would plummet. In extreme cases, if a significant impropriety was suspected or proven, she could be completely ruined, cast out from respectable society with little hope of redemption. The weight of her family's honor often rested heavily on her perceived adherence to these rules. Living under the constant gaze of a chaperone profoundly shaped a single woman's existence. It severely limited her freedom of movement and her independence. Spontaneous outings were virtually impossible. Opportunities for private, unobserved conversations, even with potential suitors she might genuinely be interested in, were few and far between. The system fostered a sense of dependence and could be incredibly frustrating for spirited young women who yearned for a little more autonomy. Imagine trying to get to know someone, to gauge their true character, with a third person always present, monitoring every word and glance. It made the already complex dance of courtship even more stilted and artificial. For many, the chaperone was a symbol of the gilded cage in which Victorian women of a certain class lived, a life of material comfort perhaps, but one tightly constrained by societal expectations and the ever-present need to protect a reputation deemed more valuable than personal freedom. Number 7. The art of the swoon. Fainting as a feminine virtue. In the thoroughly corseted and emotionally constrained world of the Victorian lady, a peculiar phenomenon often took center stage in literature, art, and even real life: the swoon. Fainting, or the appearance of being on the verge of fainting, was not always seen as a mere medical event. For single women, particularly those of the genteel classes, it could sometimes be perceived, and perhaps even cultivated, as a sign of delicate sensibility, refined nerves, and an appropriately feminine fragility. This was an era that idealized women as ethereal, almost otherworldly beings, far removed from the coarse realities of life, and a tendency to become overwhelmed to the point of losing consciousness seemed to fit this narrative perfectly. The reasons behind this curious embrace of fainting were complex. Medically, women were often considered to be inherently weaker and more prone to nervous disorders than men. Tight lacing from corsets, which could restrict breathing and circulation, undoubtedly contributed to actual instances of fainting. But beyond the purely physical, there was a strong social and cultural component. Victorian society valued emotional restraint in public, yet it also expected women to be creatures of deep feeling. A faint could paradoxically be a dramatic yet socially acceptable way for a woman to display her supposed heightened sensitivity to shocking news, intense emotion, or even a stuffy room. It signaled that she was not coarse or unfeeling, but rather possessed the delicate constitution expected of a true lady. Imagine a scene. A drawing room drama unfolds. Bad news is delivered. A shocking revelation is made, or perhaps a passionate declaration of love is uttered. What was a well-bred young lady to do? A robust, hearty reaction might be seen as unseemly or masculine. But a graceful flutter of the hand to the forehead, a slight paling of the complexion, followed by a delicate slump, perhaps conveniently into the arms of a nearby gentleman, this was a reaction that fit the script. It could elicit sympathy, concern, and immediate attention. It reinforced the image of women as needing protection and care, Literature of the period is replete with heroines who swoon at critical moments. This was not always depicted as a weakness to be overcome, but rather as a natural response of a sensitive soul. Etiquette manuals, while not explicitly instructing women to faint, often discussed the importance of maintaining a delicate demeanor. The fainting couch, a type of daybed with a raised end, became a common piece of furniture in Victorian homes, perfectly designed for a lady to recline upon when feeling overwhelmed or in need of recuperation from a swoon. Of course, not all fainting was feigned or performative. The stifling clothing, lack of fresh air in crowded rooms, and genuine emotional distress could certainly lead to real episodes of losing consciousness. However, the social acceptance, and sometimes even romanticization, of fainting created an environment where it could also become a tool, consciously or unconsciously used. For a single woman navigating the treacherous waters of courtship and society, a well-timed swoon could potentially attract the attention of a desirable suitor, deflect an unwanted conversation, or extricate herself from an uncomfortable situation. It was a way of asserting a certain kind of power, the power of perceived vulnerability, in a world where women had few direct means of exerting influence. Consider the pressure on single women to be perfectly composed and demure. Any strong display of emotion, anger, overt excitement, even robust laughter, could be frowned upon. Fainting provided a loophole, a way for intense feeling to manifest in a manner that was still considered acceptably feminine. It was dramatic, yes, but also passive. The fainter was not taking aggressive action. She was succumbing, which aligned with societal expectations of female submissiveness. This idealization of fragility had a downside. It reinforced stereotypes about women's physical and emotional weakness, which were then used to justify limiting their access to education, professions, and public life. If women were so delicate that they fainted at the slightest provocation, how could they possibly cope with the rigors of university studies, the demands of a career, or the rough and tumble of political discourse? The image of the swooning lady, while perhaps romantic in novels, contributed to a broader societal perception that women were not suited for much beyond the domestic sphere. It is also important to note that this art of the swoon was largely a phenomenon of the middle and upper classes. Working-class women who labored in factories or as domestic servants had little time or societal incentive to cultivate such delicate sensibilities. Their lives demanded resilience and physical strength, not performative fragility. The swoon was a luxury, a form of social signaling available primarily to those who did not have to engage in strenuous physical labor. So, while a modern observer might view frequent fainting with medical concern or amusement, in the Victorian context, for a single woman, it could be a complex act. It could be a genuine response to physical or emotional stress, a product of restrictive clothing, or a subtly deployed social strategy. It was a behavior that reflected and reinforced the era's peculiar and often contradictory ideals about femininity, delicacy, and the proper way for a woman to navigate her world. The expectation was that she be sensitive, and sometimes the most dramatic display of that sensitivity was a complete loss of composure, gracefully executed. Number 6. Silence is golden, especially if you're a woman with opinions. In the Victorian era, a single woman's voice, particularly when it came to expressing strong opinions or engaging in intellectual debate, was often expected to be muted, if not entirely silent, especially in mixed company or in the presence of men. Prevailing ideal was that of a demure, agreeable, and largely non-assertive female. While she was encouraged to be charming and pleasant in conversation, venturing into controversial topics, expressing firm convictions, or heaven forbid, contradicting a man, was generally frowned upon and could mark her as unfeminine, strong-minded, a term often used pejoratively or even rebellious. This expectation of silence or reticence stemmed from deeply ingrained societal beliefs about the different natures and roles of men and women. Men were considered the rational, intellectual, and authoritative figures, destined to lead in public life, business, and the world of ideas. Women, on the other hand, were idealized as creatures of emotion, intuition, and domesticity. Their sphere was the home, their role to be supportive, nurturing, and to create a peaceful, harmonious environment. An outspoken woman, one who readily voiced her opinions on politics, religion, science, or other serious subjects, was seen as stepping outside her prescribed domain and challenging the established order. During social gatherings, a young unmarried woman was expected to be an attentive listener rather than an active contributor to discussions on weighty matters. Her conversation, if she was invited to speak, was generally supposed to be light, agreeable, and focused on topics deemed suitable for ladies, perhaps the weather, recent social events, art, music, as a performer or appreciator, not usually a critic, or gentle inquiries about the well-being of others. Laughing too loudly or speaking with excessive animation could also be seen as unbecoming. The ideal was a gentle murmur, a sweet smile, and an air of polite deference. If a gentleman was speaking, especially if he was pontificating on a subject of importance, it was considered good manners for the ladies present to listen with rapt attention, or at least the appearance of it, to interrupt, to challenge his assertions, or to offer a well-reasoned counter-argument would have been a bold and often ill-advised move for a single woman hoping to make a good impression and secure a favorable match. Such behavior might lead to her being labeled as argumentative blue-stocking, a derogatory term for an intellectual or literary woman, or simply difficult. These were not qualities generally sought after in a wife by the typical Victorian gentleman, who often desired a partner who would be compliant and admiring, not a Socratic sparring partner. Even in correspondence, women were often advised to be cautious about expressing overly strong opinions. Letters were a significant form of communication, but they were not always private, and a woman's written words could be scrutinized just as much as her spoken ones. The emphasis was on maintaining an image of sweet femininity and agreeable temper. This suppression of female voice had profound implications. It limited women's intellectual development and their ability to participate meaningfully in the important conversations of their time. It reinforced the idea that women's thoughts and opinions were inherently less valuable than men's. For bright, curious, and opinionated young women, this enforced silence or superficiality could be incredibly frustrating and stifling. Imagine having insatiable thoughts on a topic being discussed, but feeling compelled to remain quiet for fear of social censure. There were, of course, exceptions and subtle forms of resistance. Some families encouraged intellectual pursuits in their daughters, and some women found outlets for their thoughts in private diaries, letters to close female friends, or in philanthropic work where their organization's skills and opinions might be more valued. The rise of the women's suffrage movement later in the Victorian era saw more women daring to speak out publicly, but these were often pioneers who faced considerable opposition and ridicule. For the average single woman navigating the social scene with marriage as a primary goal, adhering to the rule of relative silence on substantial matters was often the safest, albeit most restrictive path. The pressure to be agreeable and not too clever could also lead to a certain disingenuousness in social interactions. Women might feign ignorance or downplay their intelligence to appear more appealingly feminine and less threatening to male egos. This was not necessarily a reflection of their true capabilities, but rather a survival strategy in a society that had very fixed ideas about what a desirable woman should be. So, while silence is golden can be a useful proverb in some contexts, for Victorian single women it was often less a choice and more a social mandate. It was a rule that aimed to keep women within their designated sphere, reinforcing a patriarchal structure where male voices dominated, and female intellect, if too overtly displayed, was often viewed with suspicion rather than admiration. Pressure was to be seen, admired for beauty and grace, but not necessarily heard, especially if what you had to say challenged the status quo or kiked an intellect deemed unfeminine. Number 5. The Perilous Pages. Why novels were a single woman's ruin. In an age before television, internet, or readily accessible cinema, books were a primary source of entertainment and intellectual stimulation. Yet, for single women in the Victorian era, particularly young and impressionable ones, not all reading material was considered equal or even safe. Novels, the very genre that often provides escape, empathy, and understanding, were frequently viewed with deep suspicion and sometimes outright condemnation when it came to female readers. It was a common belief that indulging too heavily in fiction, especially romantic or sensational novels, could be detrimental to a young woman's moral character, her emotional stability, and even her prospects for a good marriage. Why this fear of fiction? The concerns were manifold. Firstly, many Victorian novels, particularly those that became popular, dealt with themes of love, passion, elopement, betrayal, and social rebellion. It was feared that reading about such dramatic and often morally ambiguous situations could inflame a young woman's imagination in undesirable ways. She might develop unrealistic expectations about romance, become dissatisfied with the more mundane realities of her own life and potential suitors, or, worse still, be tempted to emulate the daring or improper behavior of fictional heroines. Her delicate sensibilities, it was argued, could be overstimulated, leading to a state of nervous excitement or melancholy. Secondly, the act of reading itself, if done to excess, was sometimes seen as an unsociable and even selfish habit for a woman. Her time, it was thought, would be better spent on domestic duties, charitable work, or cultivating accomplishments like needlework, music, or drawing, skills that would supposedly make her a better wife and mother. A woman lost in a book was a woman not attending to her prescribed responsibilities or not available for social interaction within the family circle. Furthermore, there was a concern that too much reading, especially of novels, could lead to a young woman becoming too knowing or developing ideas considered unsuitable for her sex or station. She might start to question societal norms, think critically about the limitations placed upon women, or develop intellectual ambitions that went beyond finding a husband. This was particularly worrying to those who believed that a woman's education should be geared towards making her an agreeable companion and an efficient household manager, not an independent thinker. A bluestocking, a woman who was overly intellectual or devoted to literary pursuits, was often viewed with suspicion and seen as less marriageable. Medical theories of the time also played a part. It was sometimes suggested that excessive mental exertion, such as that involved in poring over exciting novels, could be physically harmful to women, leading to brain fever, nervous exhaustion, or other uniquely feminine ailments. The female constitution was considered more delicate, and it was thought that it could not withstand the same level of intellectual or emotional stimulation as a man's. As a result, a single woman's reading was often carefully monitored and created by her parents or guardians. Safe reading material typically included religious texts, morally uplifting poetry, instructive historical accounts, often carefully edited, and perhaps some improving but dull fiction. The works of popular novelists, especially those known for their sensational plots or romantic themes, might be forbidden entirely, or only allowed in heavily abridged or purified editions. Lending libraries, which made a wider range of books accessible, were sometimes viewed with a wary eye by concerned parents. Of course, many women did read novels secretly or openly, and found in them a source of pleasure, solace, and a window into a wider world. The very popularity of novelists like Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans, who wrote under a male pseudonym partly to ensure her work was taken seriously, and Charles Dickens suggests that women were indeed avid readers of fiction. However, they often did so against a backdrop of societal disapproval, or at least caution. A young lady discovered devouring a racy French novel, for instance, could find herself in serious trouble. Her character questioned. The irony was that many of these dangerous novels were in fact written by women, or featured strong, complex female characters who grappled with the very limitations and societal expectations that their readers faced. For some female readers, these books may have been a lifeline, a way to feel understood and to explore ideas and emotions that had no outlet in their constrained daily lives. So, while the image of a demure lady quietly reading might seem innocuous to us, in the Victorian context, the specific content of her book, especially if it was a novel, could be a matter of considerable concern. The perilous pages of fiction were believed to hold the power to corrupt innocence, incite rebellion, foster discontent, and ultimately make a single woman less fit for her perceived role in society. This fear of novels highlights the extent to which Victorian society sought to control not just women's actions, but also their thoughts and imaginations, all in the name of preserving a particular ideal of femininity. Number 4. No exertion, please. The delicate matter of female exercise. The Victorian ideal of femininity was often synonymous with delicacy, fragility, and a certain ethereal grace. This image did not readily accommodate strenuous physical activity or the development of robust muscular strength in women. While some gentle exercise was deemed acceptable, even beneficial, for single women, the prevailing attitude was one of caution and often outright discouragement when it came to anything that might be considered too vigorous, unfeminine, or potentially harmful to their supposed delicate constitutions. What kind of exercise was considered appropriate? A leisurely walk, preferably in a sedate manner and in a suitable location like a park or garden, was generally approved. This was seen as a way to get fresh air and maintain a modicum of health without undue exertion. Gentle calisthenics, sometimes performed in the privacy of one's home using light dumbbells or wands, might also be countenanced, often promoted as a way to improve posture and grace rather than build strength. Dancing, particularly the carefully choreographed dances of the ballroom, was another socially acceptable form of physical activity, though its primary purpose was social interaction and the display of elegance. However, activities that involved running, jumping, heavy lifting, excessive sweating, or any display of overt athleticism were largely considered unsuitable for ladies, especially unmarried ones. Sports as we know them today were almost exclusively a male domain. The idea of women participating in competitive games or engaging in activities that required significant physical prowess was often met with ridicule or concern. It was feared that such exertion could lead to a loss of feminine softness, make women appear masculine, or even damage their internal organs, thereby impairing their future ability to bear children, a primary societal expectation for women. Medical opinion of the era often supported these restrictive views. Doctors frequently warned against over-exertion for women, linking it to a host of supposed female ailments, from hysteria and nervous disorders to reproductive problems. The female body was seen as inherently more fragile and designed primarily for motherhood, not for athletic achievement. Tight corsetry worn by many women also physically restricted movement and breathing, making vigorous activity uncomfortable and even dangerous. Consider the popular pastimes for men during this period: cricket, rowing, football, hunting. These were celebrated as activities that built character, strength, and manliness. There were few, if any, comparable pursuits widely available or socially sanctioned for women. Even an activity like horseback riding, while engaged in by some women, was approached differently. Ladies typically rode side saddle, a less secure and more restrictive position than riding astride like men, and the emphasis was often on an elegant appearance rather than adventurous or vigorous riding. Swimming, if undertaken at all, was often done in cumbersome, heavy bathing costumes, in segregated areas, and with a focus on gentle immersion rather than active swimming. The consequences of these attitudes were significant. Limited physical activity could contribute to poor health, lack of stamina, and a general sense of physical confinement for women. It reinforced the stereotype of women as weak and dependent. For young women with natural energy and a desire for more active pursuits, these restrictions could be deeply frustrating. The lack of opportunity to develop physical confidence and competence also had broader implications for their sense of self-efficacy. Towards the later part of the Victorian era, some shifts began to occur. The rise of sports, like tennis and cycling, started to open up new avenues for female physical activity, though often with modified rules, attire, and lingering anxieties about propriety and health. The rational dress movement advocated for less restrictive clothing for women, which would allow for greater freedom of movement. However, these changes were gradual and often met with resistance. The image of the new woman emerging at the end of the century who might ride a bicycle or play tennis with gusto was often controversial and seen as a departure from traditional feminine ideals. For most of the Victorian period, however, the single woman was expected to comport herself with a gentle languor. Her physical energy was to be conserved, her movements graceful and restrained. The notion that physical fitness could be a source of empowerment, health, and joy for women, as it was for men, was slow to take root. The emphasis was firmly on preserving an image of delicate femininity, even if it meant sacrificing the benefits of a more active and physically engaged life. The message was clear. Vigorous exertion was unladylike, potentially unhealthy, and certainly not conducive to attracting a husband who desired a gentle, delicate flower for a wife. Number 3. Calling card chaos. The intricate dance of not actually meeting. In the highly structured social world of the Victorians, even the simple act of visiting someone or acknowledging an acquaintance was governed by a complex and often bewildering system of rules, at the heart of which lay the humble calling card. For single women, understanding and correctly navigating the etiquette of calling cards was absolutely essential. It was a language in itself, a way of maintaining social connections, signaling status, and adhering to the strict codes of propriety that dictated interactions, especially between the sexes and different social strata. To misstep in this realm could lead to social awkwardness, perceived slights, or even damage to one's reputation. What was a calling card? It was a small, elegantly printed or engraved card bearing one's name. A lady's card might also include her at-home day, the specific day of the week when she would be available to receive visitors. The design was usually simple and refined. Ostentatious cards were considered vulgar. These cards were not just for making introductions, they were used for a multitude of social obligations: to make a formal call, to leave in lieu of a personal visit if the person was not at home, to offer congratulations or condolences, or to inquire after someone's health. For a single woman, particularly one who was out in society, meaning she was of marriageable age and actively participating in the social season, the use of calling cards was intricately tied to her own social standing and that of her family. When moving to a new neighborhood, or after a significant social event like a ball, a flurry of calls and card leaving would ensue. These were not necessarily long, intimate visits. A formal call might last only 15 to 20 minutes. Purpose was often more about acknowledging social ties and maintaining one's place in the social hierarchy than about deep personal connection. The rules surrounding who called on whom, when, and how were incredibly specific. Generally, established residents called on newcomers. Those of higher social standing might expect to be called upon by those of lesser standing. If a single woman was calling with her mother, her name might be printed on her mother's card, or she might have her own. If leaving cards when the person was not at home, specific corners of the card could be folded to convey different messages. A turned down top right corner might indicate a personal visit, while a top left corner might signify congratulation. The nuances were subtle and varied by locality and social circle, making it a minefield for the uninitiated. One of the most peculiar aspects was the ritual of the formal morning call, which confusingly usually took place in the afternoon. If a lady was at home to receive visitors, a single woman, often accompanied by her mother or another chaperone, might pay a call. Upon arrival, their cards would be presented to a servant. They would then be ushered into the drawing room. If other callers were already present, they would wait their turn for a brief conversation with the hostess. Conversation was expected to be light and polite. Deep or controversial topics were avoided. After a short prescribed period, the visitors would take their leave, and another set of callers might arrive. It was a highly ritualized and often rather impersonal process. What made it particularly chaotic or absurd from a modern perspective was the emphasis on form over substance and the way cards could substitute for actual interaction. If you called on someone and they were not at home, which could be a polite fiction even if they were in, you would leave your card with the servant. This act fulfilled the social obligation. The recipient would then be obliged to return the call or leave their card at your residence within a specified time frame. Failure to do so could be interpreted as a snub. It was a constant, delicate balancing act of reciprocal obligations, all managed through these small pieces of pasteboard. For a single woman, her social life, and by extension her marriage prospects, could be significantly impacted by how well her family managed this system. Being included in the right calling lists and making calls on the right people was crucial for visibility and for maintaining a respectable social position. If a young lady or her family were perceived as neglecting their calling duties or as not understanding the correct etiquette, they might find themselves gradually excluded from social events and circles. Imagine the sheer effort involved, keeping track of who had called, whose calls needed to be returned, which families were in mourning, requiring special condolence cards, who had recently had a happy event, requiring congratulatory cards. Special card trays were kept in hallways to receive the daily influx of cards. It was a significant administrative task, often managed by the lady of the house with the help of her daughters. This system, while seemingly designed to facilitate social connection, could also create barriers and reinforce social stratification. It allowed people to maintain a wide network of acquaintances without necessarily investing in deep relationships. For a single woman, it meant that many of her social interactions were highly formalized and mediated. Chances for spontaneous, informal encounters, especially with eligible young men, were limited outside of carefully orchestrated events like balls or dinner parties, and even then, the watchful eyes of chaperones and the weight of etiquette prevailed. The calling card system was a testament to the Victorian love of order, propriety, and clearly defined social hierarchies, but it also contributed to a social landscape that for single women could be both intricate and isolating, a constant performance of politeness where true connection sometimes got lost in the shuffle of cards. Number 2. Marry or else. The dreaded fate of the surplus woman. For a single woman in the Victorian era, particularly one from the middle or upper classes, marriage was not simply a romantic aspiration. It was widely considered an economic and social necessity, the primary, if not sole, acceptable career path. Pressure to marry was immense. and the alternative, remaining unmarried, was often viewed with a mixture of pity, social awkwardness, and sometimes even disdain. The figure of the spinster or old maid was a common, often melancholic trope in society and literature, and the prospect of becoming one was a source of considerable anxiety for many young women and their families. This intense focus on marriage stemmed from several interconnected factors. Canonically, women had very few opportunities for respectable, well-paid employment. Fields like law, medicine, academia, and business were almost exclusively male domains. The few jobs available to genteel women, such as being a governess or a lady's companion, were often poorly paid, offered low social status, and provided little long-term security. Marriage, therefore, was the most common way for a woman to achieve financial stability and a recognized social position through her husband. Socially, a married woman gained status and a defined role within the community as a wife and, typically, a mother. An unmarried woman, especially as she grew older, could find herself in a more ambiguous and often marginalized position. She might be dependent on the charity of relatives, living as an unpaid helper in the household of a brother or sister. While some unmarried women carved out fulfilling lives through family connections, religious work, or charitable activities, they often lacked the autonomy and respect afforded to their married counterparts. The term surplus women or redundant women gained currency during this period, particularly in Britain, due to census data that showed a significantly higher number of women than men, especially in the marriageable age groups. This demographic imbalance, exacerbated by factors like male emigration and higher male mortality rates in certain occupations or colonial service, meant that statistically not all women could marry even if they wished to. This reality, however, did little to lessen the societal expectation that they should marry. The surplus woman was often portrayed as a problem to be solved, rather than an individual with her own potential and desires. The life of an unmarried woman, often caricatured as lonely and unfulfilled, was a constant, unspoken and sometimes spoken warning to younger single women. From a young age, girls were groomed for marriage. Their education often focused on accomplishments, such as playing the piano, singing, drawing, and speaking French, designed to make them attractive to potential suitors, rather than on developing practical skills for independent living or intellectual pursuits for their own sake. The social season, with its balls, dinners, and parties, was essentially a marriage market, where young women were displayed and assessed by eligible bachelors and their families. If a woman failed to secure a husband by a certain age, say her late 20s or early 30s, she might begin to be considered on the shelf, her chances of marriage diminishing with each passing year. This could lead to significant personal distress and a sense of failure, not just for the woman herself, but also for her family, who might feel they had not succeeded in their duty to see her suitably settled. The term spinster, originally a neutral term for a woman who spins thread, gradually took on negative connotations, implying someone unwanted or unchosen. Old maid was even more derogatory, often associated with fussiness, eccentricity, or bitterness. While these were stereotypes, they reflected a societal discomfort with women who existed outside the normative framework of marriage and motherhood. There were, of course, women who chose not to marry, or who found contentment and purpose outside of marriage. Some dedicated their lives to family, to religious callings, or increasingly towards the end of the era, to emerging professions like nursing or teaching. Though teaching for women was often a poorly paid and low-status job, sometimes seen as a last resort for those who did not marry. Figures like Florence Nightingale, though exceptional, demonstrated that an unmarried woman could achieve great things. However, these were often seen as exceptions to the rule. Pressure to marry could lead women to make choices that were not necessarily in their best interests, perhaps accepting proposals from unsuitable partners out of fear of being left alone. The romantic ideal of marrying for love certainly existed, and was celebrated in literature, but practical considerations, financial security, social position, and the avoidance of spinsterhood often played a significant, if not dominant, role in marital decisions. For a single woman, then, the Victorian era was a period where her entire worth and future were often judged by her ability to attract a husband. The or else in marry or else was a life of potential economic precariousness, social marginalization, and the constant, often pitying gaze of a society that had a very narrow definition of female success. This immense pressure shaped her education, her social interactions, her aspirations, and her deepest anxieties, making the quest for a husband not just a personal desire, but a critical mission for survival and acceptance in the Victorian world. Number 1. The accidental flirtation. How a dropped handkerchief could signal desire. In the Victorian era, where direct communication between single men and women was heavily restricted and chaperoned, and where female modesty was prized above almost all else, the language of courtship often relied on subtle indirect signals. A glance held a moment too long, a slight blush. The way a fan was handled, these tiny gestures could be imbued with immense meaning. Among the most curious and potentially perilous of these unspoken signals was the simple act of a lady dropping her handkerchief. Far from being a mere accident, this could be interpreted or misinterpreted as a deliberate invitation, a subtle sign of interest, or even an act of flirtation. The handkerchief itself was an essential accessory for any Victorian lady. It was not just a practical item for dabbing a brow or stifling a cough. It was often a delicate, lace-trimmed or embroidered piece of fabric, a symbol of femininity and refinement. Given its constant presence, it naturally became part of the non-verbal vocabulary of social interaction. Etiquette manuals and societal understanding created a whole system of meaning around its use, and its accidental or seemingly accidental dropping. If a lady dropped her handkerchief and a gentleman nearby retrieved it for her, this created a brief, socially sanctioned moment of interaction. It was an opportunity for him to perform a chivalrous act, and for her to offer a graceful word of thanks. In a society where initiating a conversation with a stranger, or even a mere acquaintance of the opposite sex, could be fraught with peril for a lady's reputation, this small incident provided a legitimate opening. However, the interpretation of a dropped handkerchief could go much further. If a lady dropped her handkerchief in a way that seemed intentional, or if she did so more than once in the presence of a particular gentleman, it could be read as a signal that she was interested in him and wished for him to approach her or pay her more attention. It was a way of making an advance without overtly breaking the rules of female passivity in courtship. She was not speaking directly or boldly seeking his attention, but rather creating an opportunity for him to take the initiative. The danger, of course, lay in misinterpretation. What if the handkerchief was dropped purely by accident, with no flirtatious intent whatsoever? An eager or presumptuous gentleman might misread the situation, leading to an awkward or unwanted advance. Conversely, a shy or oblivious gentleman might fail to pick up on a deliberate signal, leaving the lady feeling embarrassed or slighted. The subtlety of the gesture made it a high-stakes game. This notion was so prevalent that it became a trope in popular culture, appearing in novels, plays, and illustrations of the period. The dropped handkerchief was shorthand for a potential romantic overture. Some etiquette guides even offered advice on how to manage such situations. For instance, a lady was generally advised not to pick up her own dropped handkerchief if a gentleman was present, as this would deny him the opportunity to be gallant. The meaning could also be nuanced by context. Dropping a handkerchief near a specific gentleman at a ball might be seen as an invitation for him to ask her to dance. Doing so on the street could be a riskier proposition, potentially attracting unwelcome attention or being seen as overly forward. The language of the handkerchief was part of a broader language of the fan, or language of flowers, where objects and subtle actions were used to convey messages that could not be spoken aloud, particularly in the realm of love and courtship. For a single woman, this meant that even her most minor actions could be scrutinized and assigned meaning. She had to be constantly aware of her deportment, her gestures, and how they might be perceived by others, especially by men. An innocent accident could be misconstrued as a bold invitation, potentially damaging her reputation for modesty and propriety. If a lady was perceived as deliberately using such tactics to attract male attention too frequently or indiscriminately, she might be labeled a coquette or a flirt, terms that could undermine her social standing and her desirability as a serious marriage prospect. This rule, or rather, this widely understood social convention, highlights the incredible constraints placed upon single women in expressing their own romantic interests. Unable to pursue a man directly, they had to rely on these indirect, often ambiguous methods. The dropped handkerchief was a tool in a very limited arsenal for navigating the complexities of Victorian courtship. It symbolized the delicate dance women had to perform, appearing passive and modest, while still finding ways to signal interest and attract a suitable partner. It depicts a world where so much was left unsaid, where the smallest of gestures could carry the weight of significant social and romantic consequences, turning an everyday object into a potent symbol in the intricate game of love and marriage.